where does the seed for the passion that you have come from, if you reflect?
I think a lot of my passion comes from rage, actually. There's always like a fire burning. Everybody wants you to be perfect, but when you actually are ambitious and passionate, then they say, no, 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 that's too much. I can see what effect I have on my kids. I can see how they react to things. That kind of constant mirror is a gift and a curse, right? Because you really get to know what kind of person you are. I actively chose, being an artist because I wanted to live in the world as an artist. I wanted to have a world view of an artist, so I kind of had to craft that for myself.
Thank you for coming, and I'm very excited. It took a few chasing you down to bring you here, and I'm very excited.
I know, schedules with multiple time zones, it can be a challenge.
No, also I know that you take this summer off and you slow things down. I was seeing your mural and it was fantastic, and I was like, maybe, yeah, I think it probably now is the best time. You've had a good rest, and how are you feeling now?
Great. So glad to be back in routine. And yeah, I am a big believer in sabbaticals and taking a break from, certain types of work for seasons. So
I love that. And I'm going to ask you my first question from here. And then you're someone also who does multiple things. And I'm also going to ask this for my own self more than anyone else. You have the Tribe Network, you have your own podcast, you have your own practice. And I think you also do all of these things with a lot of effort and, very beautifully. How does it feel like? How do you deal with, and social media, of course, how do you deal with overwhelm? When you're doing like multiple things and tossing between multiple projects, and as I think as artists, even though we want to do multiple things but also equally focus on what we're doing, do it with more attention and love. how do you how do you navigate that?
Um, I think for me, it's about identifying what causes overwhelm. Having a large to-do list doesn't necessarily cause me overwhelm or drain my energy. Which is not to say that I don't feel overwhelmed, but I think it's more than that, more than just having a large to-do list. One of the ways that I do feel overwhelmed is when I am often exerting myself too much. So when I'm sharing too much of my energy with others, whether that's like in community building or in conversation. And so one of the ways that I fight overwhelm is to make sure I have a couple days or even one day where I'm not really talking that much to people, just to kind of move inward and tackle some things. I think, yeah, it's less about, what I have on my plate and more about kind of evaluating my mental health and my energy levels and making sure I'm like giving myself the space that I need to move in and out of all of those projects and spaces.
But you are not only all of those things, but you're also a mother. And I'm sure as a mother, you do not get any vacation. There's no leave day on that.
There's not, but my kids are in school full time. So, I have from 8 to 3 basically to myself, which um I've only had that schedule for a year, and so it still feels very much like a gift rather than just an expectation.
So you are someone who's really passionate. Like, I think we have very similar missions, except you're a mother and I'm not yet. Um, I'm going to ask you something. This is a very raw question. You know, how did something change for you when you became a mother as an artist? Did you have, traditionally a lot of artists feel scared? Not only artists, I think in general, women, no matter where what part of the world that we live in, no matter what we're doing. But often we feel like motherhood is going to take away time. It could take away, it could bring more responsibilities, and it could become, it could, if not hold you back, but maybe slow you down. Did you have those fears while you were, when you were there? And how did you, what were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely had, fears and anxieties around being a mother, but and this is a question that I often ask people that I interview on the Artist Mother podcast. But for me, my journey was a little bit different because I wouldn't call myself an artist until after I was already a mother. So that kind of the traditional sort of going to art school and going to grad school and doing all of those things, like building your career before you become a parent, that wasn't part of my story. I actually already had a kid when I went to grad school and chose to kind of be an artist and focus on visual art and painting. Um, so there wasn't quite that jarring like separation of identity for me. It was kind of already baked in the cake, if you will. Um, and which is not to say that that doesn't present its own challenges, but I've kind of always had to carve out my art career, in the midst of motherhood rather than adding it on after that identity and that foundation was established.
You know, um, Before we go into it, let's also talk a little bit about the beginning of your, so that we can connect the dots. Um, how did you get into the arts, and then we'll speak about how does it feel different in both the worlds today. How did you get into the arts? What was your journey? How did you begin?
Well, I think I would have gotten into the arts much earlier, but I went to a very small private school and you had to choose between music and art. They only offered those things at the same time just because of like understaffing and, underfunding. And I mean, I graduated with with a class of 36 people, so it was a very small school. Um, and so I actually remember wanting to go to, the visual art class, but all of my friends were in a choir and I liked to sing, so I chose kind of music as my path and really never thought about art again as like an option for me until I was in college and I had chosen education, elementary education, as kind of my college path and got into the classroom and found myself very unhappy and not wanting to spend every day of my life kind of around fourth graders. So at that point I had you know gained an interest in photography and was working in a coffee shop and decided to buy a camera and realized like maybe I could switch my major to something that would connect me to this like hobby or this interest rather than, this like career path that I thought I was on. So I ended up switching my major to communications because I was kind of too late. I was too close to graduation to switch to art, but I took as many art classes as I could. And that kind of got me started. I ended up starting a commercial photography business and did wedding and portrait photography for years, which I learned a lot of marketing and PR skills.
The real life skills.
Yeah, doing that business. And then, eventually that also wasn't art enough for me.
Yeah.
So I,
I get that.
yeah, I kind of swung even further away from a traditional quote unquote career and, went back to grad school for painting.
What was your first stint, and something like, did you, as okay, you felt like, okay, now I feel like an artist?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think I wanted, that capital A artist title, but I didn't really know. I didn't have a lot of models for what that would look like. And that's why I chose the grad school path, because I felt like I needed a structure to kind of lean into that would give me a, a foundation, like that would help me build that foundation that I was missing. And I'm certainly not one to necessarily recommend grad school. I don't think it's for everybody. Especially now, like that was in 2015, and even now there's so much more visibility for art careers and different paths artists can take. But I was living very rurally. I didn't have an arts community. I didn't see people, every day. So, um, yeah. So I went to grad school, and that was kind of my commitment to, okay, now I'm choosing this path, which is interesting because I think a lot of artists feel like art chose them, like it was something that they just had to do. They had to make art. They always felt this like compulsion, and that wasn't really true for me. I actively chose, being an artist because I wanted to live in the world as an artist. I wanted to have a worldview of an artist, so I kind of had to like craft that for myself.
Did you have your fears? Also, like you said, you also grew up rurally at that point, and also not have, like, let's say, a role model, someone who would, okay, this is a successful person, this is someone who does what I like, and probably I want to be like this person. At a point like that, did you have your fears about, okay, I may do this, but can I make a career out of this? But can this be something that I can do for a living? Did you have those questions, or you were like, okay, I want to do this, but I don't know where this would go?
I definitely had those questions. I think uh, where my partner and I were living at the time afforded a bit more flexibility. We were living very rurally and in a location where basically most of our expenses were covered by my husband's job. He's a college professor, so he doesn't make much money, but we were living in a place where it was very cheap to live. We had bought a house for very cheap and we're fixing it up. And um, so we kind of really scaled back our lifestyle in order to allow that flexibility for me. We weren't reliant on me making money. And that like, I think there's something to be said for the pressure to make money because, when you're living in a place where you need to make money, like you figure out how to do it, right?
Yeah, you have, you pull things together.
Yeah, and for me, I think I didn't have the same pressure. I had like a little bit more time, so things could build a bit more organically, and that really led to like a lot of surprises and just kind of following the flow of the community and following the flow of my career path, which I don't take for granted. Like I realize that's a very privileged way to go about building a career.
But tell me something, even at that point, were you someone who was very passionate about what you're like, not only community, I would say, but womanhood, motherhood, um, being a woman, that the female perspective, or it just, at what point I feel like, because I feel in my own experience also, I feel like growing up in a patriarchal setup, looking at how women are treated very passively also, in the society where I grew up, I think that really ingrained that thought for me. And I felt like day by day I was just building on that. I never intended to have my art or my community or anything on those lines, but it always felt something that was so true to my bones. I knew that I couldn't hold myself back. Do you think where does the seed for the passion that you have come from, if you reflect?
Hmm. I was actually just referring to something related to this in a conversation with a friend last night. I think a lot of my passion comes from rage, actually. I don't know if you've heard of the Enneagram, but it's a like a personality type um, system, and yeah, and certain numbers are kind of oriented around anger and rage, and I definitely feel anger very strongly. It's like an emotion that's very easy to access for me. But I was talking with a friend last night that I think the the high side of that is that I have a lot of passion, just like
It drives you.
naturally.
It
Um,
pushes you.
yeah, like I just kind of am fueled. There's always like a fire burning. There's always something um, that I want to fix, something that I want to do. And I think a lot of times I feel as a woman and as a mother, I feel like ashamed of that ambition because, I think we kind of get the impression that there's a specific way that we're supposed to be in the world. We're not supposed to do too much, because then, well, things must be falling apart at home, or we must be neglecting our kids if we have a good career, or um, like everybody wants you to be perfect, but when you actually are ambitious and passionate, then they say, no, 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 that's too much, so
When did you start having these thoughts? Was it like since, like, growing up, or was it, I don't know, I'm just trying to understand, where did you pick up this and it became, how did it grow into what you are today?
I think probably in high school, just kind of wanting to be everything to everybody and wanting to be an athlete and be a good student and be artistic and sing, and you know and also feeling like maybe it's not okay to pursue so many things at once, like kind of having some insecurity about that. Yeah, I think probably in high school. And, kind of having like your parents' expectations that you're trying to live up to, and at the same time finding your own identity.
And let's say once you figured this feeling out, how did it crystallize into, did you what kind of, let's start with what kind of work that you started making, so that we can, um, navigate our ways through that. um, did you start how did you start painting or making, as just as we, as artists start?
Yeah, so I applied to grad school with some work that I was making that was combining photography and painting. It was not very good. Uh, I look back on it now, and I'm like, what was I thinking? How did I ever get into this school? But thankfully, I did. And yeah, I was very inspired by um, abstract painters like Joan Mitchell and Lee Krasner and Helen Frankenthaler, and kind of this like Abex legacy of women painters who, didn't get like the fame and the fortune at the time, but were making the big work anyway. And um, that was kind of the vision that I had for my work. And my work has really changed over time. I spent, many years really just focusing on painting, particularly with acrylics and water-based medium, because I was working in a home studio and had kids around. Um, and then eventually, my work now is transitioned to include textiles. So my work really combines painting and sewing and textile. It's mixed media, but part of that integration of textiles into my work and sewing practices was also influenced by motherhood, of just having access to more materials more often, and um, having a practice that can kind of be picked up and put down quickly. Um, so yeah, it's definitely transitions over time, because of kind of the lifestyle that I have.
Did you tell me? I was speaking to someone only today, and we were talking about transitions in work. While as artists, we're taught the idea that we can have one style all our life. We can be known. We should be known. Um, Whereas as artists ourselves, we know how monotonous and how boxing that could feel, and how it is so necessary for us to keep pushing the envelope once we feel like, okay, I figured this out, I've done this, what next? But the place of what next, and you moving away in the sense of transitioning and evolving to textiles. Did that in any way, you know I remember when I was my biggest fear, I didn't incorporate, I come from fashion. I loved embroideries always. Never incorporated in the beginning because I had this concept that I didn't want to be too crafty. I didn't want to be too, I wanted to be an artist with a capital A. And I remember I was always boxed that, oh, you're a designer. Oh, you come from fashion. Oh, this is not wish, fine art. And there was a very specific way of being a fine artist. And I'd been working in the commercial arts and design, that I didn't want to do this, commercial and so much. So I was so afraid to run out of that traditional method. And only when I, figured, okay, I felt safe enough, and I was like, I think only between, like, in COVID, I started to um, just because I didn't have enough influence around me, I started to work with embroideries, and that led me to my work today. But I did have a lot of this cultural thing, like, okay, is it too crafty? Is it art enough? Is it not enough? Did you have those questions?
Definitely not so much the craft. I've always been interested in mixed media work and work that incorporated like found material. So that part of the conversation, I don't know if I just didn't hear, a lot of the critique around craft, quote unquote craft work, but I I didn't like buy into that as much. For me, it was more that I felt like if I were to incorporate textiles, and specifically um, quilts, and kind of let the legacy of quilting influence my practice, that I needed like a story about a grandma who taught me how to quilt. Like that was kind of, it seemed like every artist I knew who had that, it was like, well, yeah, I learned how to quilt from Aunt Mabel, or and so that was kind of like my insecurity, was I felt like I never had somebody teaching me this thing, so it wasn't right for me to kind of bring it into my repertoire.
You figured this on your own.
Well, actually, I went ahead and started quilting anyway. And then come to find out, my great grandmother was like this epic quilter. And I have some of her quilts now, and my aunt like pulled out all these quilts and showed them to me, and she actually had a little quilt studio in the farmhouse, and so I'm obviously, like, it's really nice to kind of wrap up that story with that realization, but I'm glad that I didn't let that hold me back, that I didn't say I don't have the like qualifications to kind of bring this, cuz what qualifications do I have to be a painter? Like, I'm a white girl from rural America. Like there's no painting legacy in my history, and yet this is still a medium that is calling to me and that I want to work with.
Okay, tell me something. Then you started, not only you, of course, we've spoken about your career as an artist, but then you're another part that I also feel like, I feel like as artists, one way of specifically people like us who have extended our studio practice and our practice is way beyond just being in the studio, building communities, being with people. Um, at what point, first, I want to ask you what led you to create Thrive and being in a, having these because it is for sure not easy. It is very overwhelming with having children and being taking your own practice. It really needs a lot of dedication and passion. What was your driving force to start being in community and start community building and have Thrive?
Well, so the Thrive Together Network is a collaboration with Jamie Smith, my business partner in Vancouver, Canada, and I'm based in the States. And Jamie and I actually combined our communities and our businesses after I had started the Artist Mother podcast and, kind of grew a community online and um, had folks who were in like programming that I was offering and different things. And we made the decision to combine our communities and our businesses because I just couldn't do it on my own, and I think Jamie too, like it's very hard. I mean, this, like it's very hard to do the work of community building. And it's even harder to do that work when you're doing it alone, when it's just kind of your vision. And having a business partner is very different than just hiring people to work for you, because when you're still the only kind of
Driver. It's like having a co-pilot.
yeah, and I think that really frees up like mental space,
Yeah.
which
You can lean
um
on to each other. You don't have to drive everything yourself and let everybody lean on to you.
yeah. So I started the Artist Mother podcast back in well, I started producing the podcast in 2018. We released episodes in February of 2019. And, that was really back to this idea about just not having models and visibility, living in a rural community. I didn't know artists, and I especially didn't know artists who were parents, and I didn't know how people were making it work like day to day, not
Yeah, yeah.
not like questions about how do you get a gallery to notice you. Like I didn't even really care about questions like that at the time. I just wanted to know, how are you structuring your day? Like
Yeah.
how are you making work that is bigger and beyond just the nap time hours, like are your kids, do you have childcare? How are you paying for that childcare? Just I kind of really wanted to
Yeah.
know
Real
the
life.
logistics of how people were structuring their life. And so that's why I started the podcast, because I needed some questions answered. I needed to figure it out, And of course, there was hundreds of other people out there who had the same questions, who were wondering, and people even who have more established careers. I think there's still just kind of this question about, am I doing this in a way that like is bringing me joy? Is this best for my family? Like it's really good to hear how other people are doing it and either
Yeah.
draw inspiration from that, maybe make tweaks to your own practice and process.
And I think also knowing sense of belongingness. I think even if we're all our unique ways, just knowing that, okay, I remember like I don't know, I was very alone, and a lot of things that I thought at that point that I was messed up, that I didn't know enough or I wasn't doing enough. And quickly when I started to speak to people and realize, okay, this is just not a me problem. This is generalized and I'm not alone. And somebody's gone through this and maybe I will find my own way. But just knowing that, okay, what I'm experiencing is a collective experience, I think really helped me.
Yeah, that visibility, that sharing stories, and that podcasting specifically can provide, I think is just priceless.
Yeah. Okay. So tell me something. Okay, this is a tricky one. I really want to hear your thoughts about this though. You've done the other way. You became a mother and then you led and created your career path as an artist. What do you think was your biggest strength? What did really help you on this path in this process, being a mother and choosing to be an artist, then on the contrary to, let's say, vice versa?
I think, I didn't have to go through a big transition, kind of giving up 8-hour days in the studio. Like I never had that. So
So you feel you made your own plan as per around your children since the beginning.
yeah, that integration was already there. So my career, it really has I have the expectation that my career will sort of always be flexible. I don't have like a rigidity to my practice that I think other artists have, particularly artists who, were trained kind of in old school ways of being methods. So I don't have as much like dismantling of all of those rules around being an artist to do. I think that's a pretty big strength, there's kind of always been this like rogue way that I've gone about this because that's all I had to work with.
And also, I think getting crafty. I think once you don't know the rules and you are like, okay, I get to figure this out on my own. So you never know if you're doing right or wrong. You just know you're doing, as long as you're doing something, I think that's like, okay, at least I'm taking one step. At least I'm doing something, if not the right thing.
Yeah, so I guess like adaptability maybe is kind of the strength that we're talking about, and resilience, like just always I'm always going to make the work even if it takes me longer than I thought, or if I have to change the method kind of thing. Yeah, that's a good question. I like that. Good positive way to spin it.
And what do you think was um, the hardest part for you navigating um, the difficult part of this process?
I think, you know, speaking very vulnerably, I think feeling like I, you know, I think the number one thing that helps artists grow their career is time, right? Putting the time in. And I think for me, I've seen a bit of a slower evolution with my work because, not for lack of wanting, but I haven't I don't have 40 hours a week to put into my practice. However, I don't think that and I'm not speaking for myself, but I don't think spending a lot of time on work equals great work. That's not what I'm saying, but I think in terms of the career growth and the trajectory of my career, those things just take a lot of time to develop, and I think that's been the biggest challenge for me, is just feeling like, maybe something that took me 10 years to accomplish would have taken an artist with a different lifestyle only 6 years. And so kind of just being patient and remembering that, I hope to be making art my whole life, so that's okay.
Yeah, this isn't like a one time thing. And I think, I remember I was listening to a video and I really liked what he said. It's like you have your career, how fast you want to go, how much successful you want to be, and how much life you want to live. These are three tangents, and you can have two at a time. If you want to live a life and if you want to, let's say, you want more success, then your time is going to be the biggest compromise. If you do not, so what he was trying to say was, if if you want to build a sustainable, and if you want to have control over your time, and you want to have a life, be ready, because this is going to be like building blocks. It's not going to be a skyrocket. Versus if you want to go, okay, you're like, I want to do this all in, and like, I don't care what I have to do it, and you give up everything, so you compromise your sanity, and like, all of those things, and you can find that uh, jump and increase and or leap, whatever we can call it. So I think we all have our own ways, and I also think it is, sometimes it is also season, where, okay, you can take a few leaps and you can go rogue, you can have that imbalance. But then, if you're someone who likes to have, and I think more than a lot of artists like grounding and having that kind of sustainability, I think is also essential for our careers.
Yeah, I need that the book or podcast that you referenced, because that's a great analogy. I think one of the ways that I think about it, which is a little bit cliche in like the artist mother community, is that you can only wear so many hats at a time. Like we feel like we have 10 hats to wear, but really, you can't wear 10 hats at once. Like you can only kind of shift through a couple, like you can only prioritize a couple things at a time if you're going to do them with integrity and you're going to do them well, and so we're kind of always making these choices about what's important to us. But I like the way that, that person framed the idea of time just being one of those resources, and we don't have unlimited time for everything. So it becomes either super fast paced, or, we allow ourselves kind of the luxury of experiencing time at a slower rate. And I totally agree with you that it's very seasonal. It's I don't want to go all out all the time. That's why I take sabbatical and why I don't answer emails like on the weekends. And I want to like have these spaces in my life where I'm kind of moving in and out of um modes of being.
How now you're not like an early mother. I mean, you have your own experience. How do you think all these years of motherhood, has that impacted you as an artist, and also as someone, who's so passionate about building a community that is centered around bringing mothers, women, you know all of us together?
I think your kids really offer you a good mirror of yourself. So, better or worse, I think th- I've I think through motherhood, I've really come to know myself in ways that before I had kids, I don't think I always really understood like how I was showing up in the world. And I feel like because I can see what effect I have on my kids. I can see how they react to things. That kind of constant mirror is um, a gift and a curse, right? Because you really get to know what kind of person you are, um, which I think has helped in community building, because community building is it requires a lot of energy and a lot of attention, and um, a lot of work. And yeah, I think just like understanding my limits has been really helpful in that.
I love that. I think that's a really good point.
It's scary too, though.
I don't have kids, but in the past 2 years, we have two children in the house. I have a nephew and a niece, and I spend a lot of my time. And I think something that having being around kids and loving kids and having kids in your life also makes you, um, I think, another skill set, or I think the advantage I feel personally is, you become really conscious of your choices, in the sense of, it. I think if you're really taking away time from that, it really needs to mean something, and you're not really, I think, um, just doing things for the sake of doing. You really need to know that, okay, if I'm going to do this, I really need a reason, in the sense of, that this, you're very conscious of your choices, I think. And I think that also brings around that awareness about, okay, who you are, does this really matter to me, and things like that.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I totally agree that I want my kids to like see me happy and enjoying my life and putting my passions to use in things that I really care about too. Like I want them to know that like you don't have to have a job just to have a job. Like you know you'd probably do at certain stages of your life, but you can also um you can also figure out ways to spend your time because you just love something and you want to do it. I want them to know that that's okay, and to see me spending my time and energy on things that bring me joy and are valuable to me. um but yeah, like you said, again, I was just having a conversation with somebody this week about how there's just only so much time in the day, and when you have kids around, you can't you can't do everything that you're passionate about. Like, you're kind of always making compromises, and so if you really want to be an artist, like, that has to be one of the higher priorities on your
Yeah,
list.
yeah. And tell me something. I've heard this around with a lot of mothers, and I think, how much are your kids involved in, let's say, in your creative practice? Did you in the beginning had that pressure, in the sense of, okay, um, you know, should you bring the studio kids in the studio? Do they have to be participative, or are they today? How did you navigate that?
It worked really well when I just had one kid, but I have all these pictures of my oldest in the studio with me, and he also was just a different kid than my other two. He was very independent and, you know, good just with a book and a place to sit. So he had a lot of patience for my studio time and my practice. I think, as soon as there were more than one kid
One,
hanging
it became a
around,
gang.
like it was like, no, this is not possible. And I really admire parents who make work like with their children, and not necessarily like I'm letting my kids paint on my canvas, but more conceptually, like kind of using, rituals and routines and um, conversations that they're having within their home to kind of inspire their artwork. Like, I think that is really interesting and beautiful. Um, there's been then there's been work that I've pursued that I've kind of tried to be a little bit more inclusive, but I will say that I do think I just work well with boundaries, and when I can kind of, as I mentioned before, move in and out of certain modes of being. So, I'm not thinking about my art that much when I'm with my kids. Like, I'm really not.
I think this was my first experience. I was telling this my partner, like, when I had children at home, and we didn't have them before. This was our first generation. My brother had kids, and something that I totally love now is how much power children have when you have them. Like, when I go back home, I really go back home. I mean, if I'm not working and if I'm with them, no matter what's going in my life, how bad I want it, how bad the situation is, or how good it is, once you're with kids, you're just with them. They consume you and they disconnect you in a way that, your world. And I really like that about it, because I think in a life that we're living today, we're so overworked. We're always thinking about how much we've achieved, how much we've not done, and how what's next, constantly on social media, posting and like this and that. And it's like we're constantly running towards things, and or things are running towards us, that is so hard to disconnect. And I found it so refreshing that how how I think on a whole level, how how great that felt and how good that feels today. So I think that's amazing.
Yes, that's a beautiful way to put it. They tether you to the present moment, I think. And that's why I really try to be off my phone as much as possible when I'm with my kids, because that gift of presence is so rare. Like, I don't get it in other places in my life. So that's a great reminder.
Good. Do your children understand what you do? Do they understand um you know their mother is an artist? Do they understand? I think it's one of the privileges. I feel like children who grow around creative mothers or parents, I think it's a blessing. I had my mom. She wasn't as per creative in the sense of, as an artist, but she was very creative. And I think a lot of my own influence comes from her on how crafty and how creative she was. So how do your children react to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very normal to them. I think the harder thing to describe is like, well, I run a network of online people and they all come, like it's more the like virtual aspect of, kind of community building they don't quite understand, which is funny because that's easier to explain to adults. Like, I think, adults who are not in the art world, they're very like they understand, oh, you have a podcast much more easily than like, oh, you like make things and like do you sell them? And I'm like, well, no, not always. And they're like, but then what do you do with it? Like that kind of whereas my kids really understand, oh, you made something cool. That's great. So it's kind of reversed. It's interesting.
Oh my God, this was so amazing, Kaylin. Thank you so much for your time. I really, really enjoyed talking to you. But one last thing before I let you go, please take this space and can you tell us how can we support you? Where can we find your work? How can we know more about Thrive, Artist Mother podcast, and anything that you want to share with us? Anything, any new project that also you are working on?
Yeah, thank you for asking, and you're a great interviewer. This was a wonderful conversation.
Thank
I
you.
think, yeah, if you're like kind of looking for that visibility of being an artist and caregiver, definitely tune into the other Artist Mother podcast. It's available, and I'm we release like 2 to 3 episodes a month, so we're still pretty consistent with publishing. I also have another podcast that I co-host with Jamie called the Thriving Artist Podcast, and that is like 10 to 15 minute short little episodes, really just about a topic, kind of a practical tip, or like how to plan out your week or how to have a closing routine in the studio. So definitely give that a listen if you want kind of more just like art advice or inspiration. And yeah, the Thrive Together Network is kind of the virtual community that we run, and we always have something new going on there. It's a great place to plug into. We'll be really wrapping up, the year and kind of doing our big push for planning in 2024. So I think like the biggest thing our community offers, other than connecting with, hundreds of artists, is Jamie and I offer planning tools for artists. So we have, a calendar and kind of goal setting activities and all this stuff that can really help you get organized in the studio and plan for the year ahead. So that's kind of where my brain is at, even though it's only September. I'm like, you know,
I'm like, oh my God, 2024. Oh, is it already here?
it's coming up. And then my art practice, I actually had a lot of shows early this year. So the rest of the year, I just get to be in the studio, and I don't really have deadlines until 2024. So I'm really looking
Enjoying
forward
that
to
time,
having
taking that
some,
time.
yeah, just some slower time in there. Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. It was so nice talking to you, and I really appreciate your time. And I hope to see you soon again.
Thank you, Charuka. It was so great to talk to you.